Nagash, also known as the Great Necromancer, was the first practitioner and creator of necromancy, and is the most powerful magic user of all time, his power rivaling that of the ancient Slan and High Elf wizards from the dawn of time that fought in the First Great War against Chaos. He caused the complete destruction of the civilization of Nehekara, that titanic engine of human achievement, and created the undead, also indirectly creating the first vampires. Although once a mortal man, Nagash became a lich, the most powerful form of undead, casting aside his mortal flesh in favour of magical power and an unmatched mastery over the arcane. He is many thousands of years old, and endured where others would have perished. During his absence, Nagash has sought one thing and one thing alone: absolute power over all things. He is relentless in his ambition for total domination over the world, and will stop at nothing to see his dreams realized. He controls an entire legion of followers, worshippers and acolytes who have done his bidding faithfully, serving him as a god and furthering his fell schemes. He has been one of the greatest threats the world has ever faced, and was only stopped at a great cost each time he rose, never being truly defeated. In his attempts to become a god, Nagash learned how to tap the power of magic into certain materials, and also constructed the Black Pyramid, the largest structure ever built by human hands. Its purpose was to draw the winds of magic south, so that he could use more magical power for himself to fuel his megalomaniacal dreams. Ironically, after thousands of years of constant setbacks, Nagash finally got what he wanted, although not before he was humiliated by the forces of chaos. Okay, so Nagash is possibly as close as you can get in the Warhammer universe to, like, one single bad guy character who's, the most one individual that is the most evil or has the most evil power. I know there's a lot of guys in the, unless you're talking about actual gods, like I suppose you could say Khorne does more evil than Nagash. If we're talking just about one human or humanoid person, Nagash has got to be at least up there. Off the top of my head, I can't think of someone who's, creating this amount of evil power. You know what I mean? And he keeps coming back. He's a real kind of, he's like the Bond villain of Warhammer fantasy. I mean, as for other undead people, obviously a lot of them are quite evil, but they're humans, they're not completely one-dimensional. But, vampires, like you have the whole von Karstein and Isabella story where they're like really in love and they care about each other and stuff. So necromancy isn't necessarily evil, it's kind of just like gives people certain, it's a window to power, and you can't really judge someone for going into something slightly sketchy in order to get power. I mean, it's like dealing drugs or something like that. So yeah, these are all kind of amoral humans, as we all are in reality. Like they're just people that have made decisions that not necessarily everyone would make. But Nagash is a real psycho. Like, he's completely out for himself. He probably is actually a psychopath mentally, and he really, wants himself to be the only human left on the world. Basically, he's absolutely crazy. Although he's not a human anymore, he's a lich. But anyway, another example of undead people just being humans. There's a type of vampire called the Blood Dragon, which was founded by this guy called Abhorash, and he basically, let me just read an extract for you. Abhorash came upon the lair of a great dragon, and against all advice entered it, engaging the beast in battle by himself, as Abhorash was seeking a worthy foe. Obviously this guy's a massive badass already at this point. When the battle ended, Abarash was triumphant 1v1 the dragon, and drank deeply from the dragon's blood. To his surprise, it cured his constant thirst. He maintained in his vampiric form, but had no need to drink blood any further. At that point, Abarash told his followers that his search had ended. He had found his answer. He commanded his followers to go back out into the world and master the arts of combat, and seek the blood of the strongest of foes so that they too might overcome their thirst. So this kind of shows you that there's a certain desire to not want to be a vampire as much. I mean, obviously they enjoy the powers that they get, but they don't like the vampire curse of the constant need to kill people and eat them. You know, they're not actually about that. They feel that desire, but it's more like a drug addiction than any real kind of actual mental will to be doing it. This isn't the same for all of them. Obviously, some of them probably love it. But, yeah, I'm just saying they're nuanced. They're like real humans, you know? Like, they're just people with different outlooks on things and different opinions. But, yeah, because they're immortal, they can train up until they're getting to the point where they're, like, incredibly good at fighting, and then they go out and try and kill a dragon so that they can lift the curse like Abarash did. And he's the founder of the Blood Dragons, which is the Blood Knights cavalry unit from the Vampire Counts in Warhammer Total War. So yeah, that's why they're so good and why they're good against large units. As well as this, you have just the fact that a lot of vampires just kind of live in the Empire society with the other humans, and you know, just enjoy the fine life that they can have in the cities of the Empire amongst other humans in human society, just kind of using their powers and their general high IQ that they seem to have to just be successful and get rich, and have some kind of eloquent arrangement with hired thugs to go stab people and drain their blood, and then send them carts of wine to disguise the blood, and yeah, they pretty much sorted. They can just have a nice, comfortable life in Empire cities. They're not trying to commit any mass genocide of humans at all. They're just kind of piddling along, having a nice life for themselves. Not saying they're not selfish, they're humans, but yeah, that's basically my main point. Now, Nagash, however, had always had his sights on something more than this. And being the founder of necromancy, I suppose this isn't surprising. I suppose it's bad luck for the whole world that Nagash was born 2,000 years before the time of Sigmar in the mighty civilization known as Nehekara, because this was a civilization obsessed with death and obsessed with the preparation for the afterlife, essentially attempting to practice necromancy before it was invented. His father was King Ketep of the Third Dynasty, ruler of Khemri and all of Nehekara. As a young man, he joined the Mortuary cult, a priesthood dedicated to the veneration of the dead and the magical prolonging of life. It's basically prototype necromancy, and became a leading figure in the cult. Nagash was ambitious, and despite rising to the rank of the High Priest of Khemri, the cult's highest position, he coveted his father's throne. It was only when a group of dark elves, who had washed up on the shore of Nehekara after a battle with the High Elves, were brought to Khemri, that his quest for immortality proved fruitful. One among their number was a sorceress who revealed all of her knowledge of magic to Nagash. From her, he learned of the realm of chaos beyond the chaos wastes in the north, and of the winds of magic, and how they could be channeled. Unlike the divine magic of the priests of Khemri, based on communication with the gods, Nagash learned of magic that mortals could manipulate for themselves. He learned of Dar, and how it could be drawn to a location and condensed inside certain materials. This elf sorceress was extremely useful to Nagash, and he never would have found out about this dark magic if she had not enlightened him upon it. Soon, he learned all he could from her, and when she outlived her usefulness, Nagash murdered her companions, defeated her in a magical duel, and consumed her soul. He then proceeded to enact his plan to put himself on the throne. He brought dozens of weak and dispossessed nobles together, and gave them the ability to prolong their life. In return, they swore to serve him forever. Foremost amongst them was Arkan the Black, who became Nagash's second-in-command, and one of the most ruthless of Nagash's servants. After the death of their father, Nagash's brother, King Thutep, ascended to the throne. One night, Nagash slew his own brother, murdering him in cold blood and burying his brother's wife alive. The next morning, his hands still covered with Thutep's blood, Nagash claimed the throne of Nehekhara without opposition. Nagash used his knowledge as the basis for a new branch of magic, which he called necromancy. This magic greatly extended his lifespan, and during the centuries to come he mastered it, although he did not succeed in preserving his physical body, and it enabled him to reanimate the bodies of the dead. So he just remained animated and full of energy for years, as in centuries, while his physical body rotted down to the bones. It must have been absolutely disgusting, but you'd be too scared of him to really do anything. He ruled Khemri through fear, and with his power forced countless slaves to labour for 200 years to raise a massive pyramid of black marble. The dreaded, legendary Black Pyramid of Nagash, which he committed a great heresy in making, because he made it far larger and more imposing than the tomb of Setra the Imperishable, a testament to his hubris. Now, for a lot of people this is going to be kind of hard to relate to and understand how offensive this is, but Setra is essentially the Sigmar of Nehekhara. If Nehekhara is the Empire, he is Sigmar. He's united this entire land that was, like the Empire, split up into loads of different tribes. And although he was slightly more tyrannical than Sigmar, he is the unifier and the father of this huge civilization. And for Nagash, who's usurped his way into power anyway, to build this huge black pyramid, specifically to dwarf Setra's one, was literal heresy. One does not simply dwarf the pyramid of Setra the Imperishable, the King of Kings, High King of Nehekhara, Lord of the Earth, Monarch of the Sky, Ruler of the Four Horizons, Mighty Lion of the Infinite Desert, the Great Hawk of the Heavens, Majestic Emperor of Shifting Sands, Eternal Sovereign of Khemri's legions. Nagash used this dreaded, legendary Black Pyramid to draw the winds of magic from the far north down to the lands of Nehekhara, storing them there for his use, to aid them in his campaign, and to subdue the neighbouring kings. Bearing in mind the fact that Nehekhara is near the equator, there's naturally very little magic near there, so this is quite an advantage for him to have this. Nagash penned his knowledge and findings within 9 tomes made of human flesh, bound with dwarf hair and illuminated with human blood. These works became known as the 9 Books of Nagash. Others flocked to his promises of immortality and power. Dozens of nobles, as well as 1/3 of the Lich Priests, sided with Nagash. However, the other kings of the various Nehekharan cities were aghast with the reign of terror which Nagash had begun, and his disrespect of Setra, and railed under the terrible taxes that Nagash forced them to pay. Some 2 centuries after having been forced to witness what they saw as a blasphemy that would surely bring the wrath of the gods upon the blessed lands of Nehekhara, the kings of 7 other lesser cities allied themselves in order to remove Nagash from his throne. A powerful army was raised to march on the city of Khemri. Using his necromantic powers publicly for the first time, Nagash raised a vast horde of skeletons to destroy the attackers. In the death-obsessed culture of Nehekhara, this was recognized as the greatest of obscenities and a grave insult to the gods themselves. Hundreds panicked, terrified by the thoughts of battle versus the departed, who were sacred. Although many fled at the sight of the skeletal army, the forces of the other kings rallied, and Nagash was ultimately defeated, but not slain. Arkan gave his life to protect his master. Nagash fled to the northeast to plot his revenge. The priest kings, meanwhile, did their utmost to destroy everything Nagash had wrought. His works and many of his books were burned, and the cabal of acolytes that he had seduced to his service were put to the sword. The Arkan that gave his life to hold back the armies so that Nagash could escape is Arkan the Black, who we talked about earlier. He is the most loyal of the evil Nagash's followers, helping lead the coup that brought him to power. Arkan was also a great necromancer, and one of Nagash's most principal students. He also led great numbers of armies against Nagash's enemies, such as the priest kings that revolted against him. He launched a suicidal counterattack, giving Nagash the opportunity to escape, which held back the army of the Seven Kings, as it was called, for over an hour, using his feats of martial prowess and powerful sorcery. Finally, when Arkan fell in this suicidal attack, it was not to a hero's sword in single combat, but to a spear hurled by a nameless soldier. Arkan stared in horror at the shaft protruding from his chest, knowing that it had pierced his heart. With his dying breath, he threatened that a terrible curse would befall any who touched his corpse, and with that, he slumped to the ground. Within seconds, dark flames had consumed Arkan's flesh, leaving behind only a blackened skeleton. Whilst the rest of Nagash's followers were beheaded and burnt, none dared to risk desecrating Arkan's remains.
For hundreds of years, the priest kings continued to rule Nehekhara, but the corruption of Nagash had forever tainted the land, and it was never truly recovered. The individual city rulers had exhausted their populace in overthrowing Nagash, and they now had to contend with famines, civil wars, and marauding barbarians from distant lands. The treachery of Nagash had also tarnished the authority of the royal lines, and it was not until several centuries later that order was commenced once again.
Alcadazar was the eldest son of King Artan Heru, priest king of Kemri. The queen of Resetra and wife of Artan Heru had a troubled pregnancy, and fearing the death of her first child, the queen desperately came to the city of Lamia and begged for her child's life at the Temple of Blood. There, Neferata gave the woman an infusion containing her blood, and when the boy was born, claimed him as her own, saying he would stay in Lamia until he came of age and took his throne in Kemri. This child would be called Alcadazar. Neferata grew to believe that Alcadazar would become her latest partner, and had him trained in every aspect of war and statehood. Given a positively unnatural life by Neferata's blood, Alcadazar stayed within Lamia for many decades, postponing his rights to the throne of Kemri in hopes of achieving greater glory and prosperity for his kingdom, should he promise to marry Neferata and join the two cities in holy union. By his 50th year, Alcadazar, who was still as young, vigorous and handsome as he was in the prime of his youth, finished his indoctrination and was tricked into drinking from the elixir of life, thus becoming a vampire. Disgusted by his own queen's treachery, Alcadazar managed to escape her grasp when Ubaid, his former mentor, sacrificed himself to give him time to escape. When he escaped, Neferata chased her former lover and future husband, and partial son, surely, because she's given him some of her blood, and it's had some kind of effect. And partial son throughout the streets of her own city, her true features revealed for what they truly were. Yet Al-Kadazar knew this city well and managed to hide himself within a large ceremonial urn located at the storage room of a local potter, there shaking with horror at the revelation that he had witnessed. After a day, the prince learned to hide himself within the city's masses, avoiding the minions of his monstrous stepmother and her incestuous ways. For nearly 8 months, Al-Kadazar, Prince of Resetra and would-be King of Khemri, lived like a harbour rat among Lamia's busy docks. He looted and he stole, gambled on games of dice and drank sour beer in reeking alehouses that no city guardsman dared enter. He killed his first man in a vicious back-alley brawl when a gang of sailors tried to press-gang him onto their ship. For a time he worked as hired muscle for one of the most notorious brothels in the Red Silk district, and there fell into the company of a gang of jewel thieves who preyed upon the old noble families who lived in the shadow of the royal palace. That association had ended in blood and betrayal on a moonless night in early spring. Al-Kadazar had escaped with nothing more than a handful of copper coins and a dying woman's kiss. She had been his first love, and she had nearly been the death of him. Finally, the prince judged that his time had come. He was certain that Neferata was still looking for him, but her attention was still fixed on the caravans and the travellers' quarter. The guards at the city gates had slipped back to their daily routine, and his description had changed from the night of his escape. He was much thinner now, and his features were hidden beneath a full black beard. Dressed in faded desert robes and laden with a leather pack filled with food, spare clothing and other supplies, he passed through the eastern gate, in the middle of a torrential afternoon rainstorm. The guardsman, scowling from the doorway of the gatehouse, waved him through without so much as a second glance. But the prince soon learned that escaping the city was only the first of many challenges that lay between him and distant Resetra. Beyond the watch forts at the eastern end of the plain, the land was wild and lawless, infested with roving gangs of outlaws that preyed on unwary travellers. His hopes of falling in with an eastbound caravan were quickly dashed, as the paranoid merchants and their hired guards feared that he might be a spy for the caravan raiders. Alone and on foot, Al-Kadazar's skills were tested to the utmost over the first few months as he struggled his way across the plain. He was forced to fight for his life on more than one occasion, but his training and the lasting potency of Neferata's elixir saw him through. The road became less dangerous, but no less hard, once he had left the Golden Plain behind. Al-Kadazar made his way to Liberas, thinking that Resetra's ancient allies would lend him aid, but the prince found the city of scholars in a sad and decrepit state. The famous collegiums were all but deserted, and the palace of scholar kings was closed even to its citizens. Al-Kadazar lingered there for almost a month, waiting in vain for an audience with King Pashet, but the royal viziers refused to even listen to him. He left Liberas as road-weary and penniless as he'd been when he'd arrived. Finally, almost a full year and a half after his escape from the Temple of Blood, Al-Kadazar passed through the formidable gates of Resetra, the warlike city of his people. The prince was pleased to see that the city prospered under the rule of his younger brother Asar. This time he knew better than to approach the palace directly. He was sure that Lamia had agents in the city, and they were certain to be on the lookout for him. Instead, he made inquiries in the market, and that evening he found his way to the home of his uncle Kenti. Although Kenti was an old man now, his strength gone and his vision fading, he recognized Al-Kadazar at once. The prince was welcomed with tears of joy. Later, when he had told Kenti of what he'd seen inside the temple, his uncle wasted no time in arranging a secret meeting with Asar inside the palace. Accompanied by Kenti, Al-Kadazar was ushered into the king's privy council chamber, where he met his younger brother for the very first time. Though Asar did not possess his brother's extraordinary physique and magnetic charisma, the kinship between the two could not be denied. Asar welcomed his brother warmly, and over goblets of strong southern wine, Al-Kadazar told Asar his horrifying tale. This was the moment that the prince had been waiting months for. Sitting in the filth of Lamia's back alleys, he'd envisioned his brother's face lighting up with righteous rage as he learned of Neferata's crimes. Swift messengers would be sent across the length and breadth of the land, spreading the news and summoning armies to war. Al-Kadazar would return to the City of Dawn as a conqueror, at the head of a vast army made up of warriors from every city in Nehekhara. But Al-Kadazar was to be disappointed. The king of Resetra listened to his prince's tale, his expression thoughtful. When Al-Kadazar was finished, Asar took a long sip of wine, and then gave his brother a frank stare. Asar had made it clear that he believed every word of the prince's story, and vowed to send agents to uncover proof of Neferata's crimes. But Al-Kadazar knew that such efforts were doomed from the start. No stranger to the city could stand a chance of penetrating the palace compound and slipping undetected into the temple, and none of the temple's high priestesses could be persuaded to betray their mistress's secrets. That left only one possible alternative. If the great cities needed proof of Lamia's hidden evil, then Al-Kadazar would have to obtain it himself. He had remained as his uncle's guest for many months, formulating his plans, and then he slipped quietly from the city amid the guards of a merchant caravan bound for Libris. 6 months later, he found himself, once again, friendless and alone upon the lawless expanse of the Golden Plain. Al-Kadazar had thought that slipping back to Lamia would have been a simple matter. It had been years since the escape. For all that the rest of the world knew, he might as well have been dead. In fact, that was probably the most likely occurrence. But Neferata still hadn't given up looking for him. If anything, her search had turned far darker and more terrible than before. The city docks and the poorer districts lay under a constant pall of dread. The streets were all but deserted after dark, because people were disappearing almost every night and were never seen again. Informers were everywhere, searching for men who matched his description. The city guard had tried to detain him at the west gate, when no amount of gold would dissuade them. He'd then been forced to draw his sword and fight his way out. Mounted riders had scoured the trade road for weeks afterwards, searching for him. He'd only managed to escape by fleeing deep into abandoned farmland, where the bandits held sway. There he fell in with a tribe of bandits for 20 years. His unnatural lifespan increased further by the elixir of life. Throughout the 20 years that Al-Kadazar spent with the desert nomads, he learned much of their lifestyle and began to rise in the ranks of their society. His natural talent for command and his high levels of education and specifically military skill were a great boon to him. And of course the special abilities that were given to him by the elixir of life and the blood of Neferata. In a society where the education and rearing of noblemen can make them gods amongst men almost, this combined with the magical abilities of a vampire will certainly do the trick for upward mobility. Once Al-Kadazar managed to gain enough influence in the desert tribes, he began to use this to uncover Neferata's coven. Couriers and courtiers were captured and taken by the desert tribes, and soon the secret of Lamia was revealed. Al-Kadazar took proof of the meddlings of the Queen of Lamia, and also proof of his lineage as the eldest son of King Arten Heru, a priest king of Khemri previously, and laid claim to the throne of Nehekhara itself. Emerging out of the wilds, this supernatural king at the head of his barbarian army, a people that had not been subjugated since Setra himself was on the throne of Khemri, was a striking and symbolic sight. for many of his subjects, and many of them supported his claim without quarrel. And as Al-Kadazar addressed those that did quarrel with his claim to the throne in the quick war of succession that followed, the very metaphysical power of his countenance on the battlefield, this ancient king who was 50 years of age by the time he escaped from Lamia, remaining to be, at least in appearance, in the prime of his life, and seemingly of supernatural physical ability, even surviving huge gashes as he threw himself with an unnatural courage born of the knowledge of his immortality into the front lines of a battle, crushing the skulls of his enemies in his hands with an inhuman strength and ferocity, did a lot for his negotiating skills, certainly for the soldiers of the princes that would be facing him. It did not take long at all for them to capitulate to his armies. So then, it was not long until Al-Kadazar ascended to the rule of Kembri and Nehekhara as a whole. Under his wise and charismatic leadership, Al-Kadazar bound the great cities under his rule, and Nehekhara began to prosper once again. The treachery of Nagash was still hanging over the land, and it was hard to forget. Since his reign of terror, the mortuary cult had been watched very closely. The lich priests were forbidden from deviating from their age-old lore of incantations, which had remained unchanged for centuries before Nagash. However, the lords of the city of Lamia hungered for power over their rivals, and they had seen in Nagash's sorcery the means not only to dominate all of Nehekhara, but also the chance to live forever and to sever their dependence on the mortuary cult. To this end, they had stolen one of the blasphemous books of Nagash from the Black Pyramid, and over the course of centuries they had secretly become adept practitioners of necromancy. The Queen of Lamia, Neferata, embraced the malign magic and used her powers to consort with demonic entities. She created a tainted version of Nagash's elixir, extending her life indefinitely, yet cursing herself for all eternity. This is the elixir that she had given to Al-Kadazar forcefully, after tricking him into it. Not possessing the skill or knowledge of Nagash, Neferata and her courtiers were struck by an unquenchable thirst for mortal blood. Lamia had become the birthplace of the vampires, fell creatures whose individual strength and unholy power were greater than that of a dozen men. Fearful that necromancy would bring about the wrath of the gods, and hungry for his final revenge, King Al-Kadazar made war on the tainted vampire queen. Al-Kadazar gathered legions from every other Nehekharan city and forged them into a single massed army that he led against Lamia. Thousands of chariots raced across the land ahead of vast regiments of archers, mighty phalanxes of spearmen and battalions of giant war statues. Against such a host, not even the accursed vampires could prevail, and the power of Lamia was smashed. The Pale Queen fled, accompanied by those she had embraced into her hellish vampiric existence. I say, you can find out the servants of death by their marks. No man is born so unnatural that his body does not revolt at the foul pollution of undead blood. And by these marks you can tell them, by the fangs of the predator. For their thirst for blood is like that of a foul beast. By their porcelain white skin, cold to the touch and unnatural to the eye. The glow of their eyes behind which lives the terrible hunger. These are the marks of the blackest evil. These are the marks of the vampire. Unbeknownst to the vampires, they had been guided by the implacable will of Nagash since their creation. Residing far away in his fortress, Nagash's-Ar, amid the mountains to the north of Nehekhara, the arch-necromancer recognized the spawn of his own ancient evil and was gladdened by the corruption of Lamia. Here were worthy champions. their damnation a tribute to his dark genius. Drawing them to him, Nagash welcomed the vampires and they became his dark captains. Through them, Nagash began a new offensive against Nehekara, and the two sides fought numerous battles, the outcomes of which would pave the way for the necromancer's inevitable return. Beside the vampires came the dead warriors of a vast host, skeletons drawn from the knights and cairns of the northern lands by the power of Nagash's sorcery. Nagash resurrected his trusted servant, Arkan the Black, who won many victories in his master's name. War assailed Nehekara for years on end, and the land was irredeemably scarred. However, Alcadazar was the greatest general of his age, and he led a unified army of Nehekara against Nagash's evil for all their long years of battle. Under his leadership, the living legions of Nehekara never yielded, and finally, during the Battle of the Golden Skull, the undead hordes of Nagash were repulsed from Nehekara. The vampires scattered throughout the world to escape destruction, and without their magic and leadership, their armies of skeletons crumbled. Nagash had been defeated. There was much rejoicing throughout Nehekara, though the evil sorcerer himself still walked the land. It had been no coincidence that the vampires came across Nagash. Through his agent, Wasoran, Nagash had manipulated them from the first and lent them his magical aid from a distance during the siege of Lamia. When Neferata learned the full extent of Wasoran's manipulation, she was furious, even more so when Nagash passed her over to offer his distant relative Vashanesh a position as leader of his forces. Nagash had crafted a ring that would allow the vampire who wore it to return from the dead even more easily than they already were able to. But through the ring, Nagash could control all of vampire kind. Vashanesh had accepted the ring, and at Nagash's command, the vampires led his army to Khemri. Although at first the vampires were eager to serve as Nagash's lieutenants to gain revenge on Alcadazar and regain Lamia, it became apparent that their survival was irrelevant to Nagash. He hurled them carelessly against the enemy, as he would his mindless undead troops, and he cared not for rebuilding Lamia and sought instead to destroy all of Nehekara. Bound by the power of the ring Vashanesh wore, they were unable to disobey Nagash or even his second-in-command, Arkan. Vashanesh hit on an ingenious solution to the problem, however. Suspecting the control Nagash exerted relied on a living vampire wearing the ring, and believing the great necromancer's assurance it would return him from the grave, Vashanesh allowed Alcadazar to cut him down at the height of a battle. The vampires were freed from their control, and only Wasoran remained. The others scattered to the winds after bickering over where to go and who deserved to lead them. Madmesis and Harkete vanished out of history, although there were rumours of vampires in Far Cathay and the Southlands who may be of their lost bloodlines. Ushuran settled in Strigos. Neferata travelled widely, influencing the nations of man from their foundings, and inserting her daughters in privileged positions amongst them. Wasoran stayed by Nagash's side whilst he cursed and ranted at the fickleness of vampires. Upon Nagash's defeat, Wasoran took many of his master's writings and studied them with the aid of his acolytes and his apprentice Melchior, transcribing his notes in the dread grimoire Necronium. His mastery of necromancy grew so profoundly that he was able to limit the red thirst that drove vampires to live dangerously close to mankind, although the effect of this change was to hideously twist his line's physical form. His reward for the feat was death at Melchior's hand. Vashanesh eventually returned, as Nagash had promised that he would, and he spent the next few centuries testing the limits of his ring. Even if Nagash had truly died after being abandoned by the vampires, which seemed unlikely, the ring had allowed Arkan to control them as well, Vashanesh set out mastering certain magical arts to make the ring his slave rather than vice versa. During this time, he'd spent much of his time in the lands of Kislev, where he took up the name of Vladimir. Almost unnoticed through the annals of history, Vashanesh travelled to the land of Sylvania that he had first seen as a soldier in the Legion of Setep, and calling himself Prince Vladimir, he aided Varnal in crafting an undead host to defeat the Skaven who threatened the land in the wake of the Black Death. Content with this change he had wrought in history, he returned to hiding for another 700 years. When he came back, it was under the name Vladimir von Karstein. Back in the war-torn land of Nehekara, Nagash reeled from his defeat at the hands of Al-Kadazar and his loyalists. Such was Nagash's bitterness, and so great the potency of his thwarted ambition that he chose to end all life in Nehekara rather than see anyone else hold power over the land. He polluted the great Vitae River, poisoning it until it turned thick and dark, tainting the lands that relied on its life-bringing waters. Forever after, it was known as the Great Mortis River. Pestilence and disease ran rampant across the great land. Within a few weeks, those who had succumbed to the terrible plagues outnumbered the living. The city streets were choked with corpses as fully 9/10 of the Nehekaran population perished. Mourning for his lost people, Al-Kadazar sat upon his throne as his kingdom was destroyed. For all his skill at arms, he was powerless. Nagash's undead forces marched upon Kemri, brushing aside the city's plague-ravaged guard with impunity, and walking past the fortress walls and siege barracks unchallenged. His skeleton warriors broke into Kemri's royal palace and dragged Al-Kadazar away to rot in a dungeon cell. For the first time in centuries, Nagash sat upon the throne of Kemri, and the immortal king Al-Kadazar would rot for eternity in the dungeons beneath Nagashazar. However, Nagash did not linger in Kemri for long. Filled with insane visions of power, he returned to his fortress and began to cast the greatest and most terrifying spell ever conceived. He intended to enact the Great Ritual, a spell powerful enough to resurrect every corpse across the globe and bind them under his control. With them, Nagash would command an unstoppable army of the dead that he would use to conquer the entire world. To power his great ritual, he consumed vast quantities of warpstone and summoned all the energy stored within his cursed Black Pyramid. As Nagash chanted within his fortress, the sky began to darken for hundreds of miles around, and the ground shook. As his spell reached its crescendo, a great wave of power surged from the sorcerer's body, washing over the lands of Nehekara and stealing the life from everything in its path. Crops shriveled, and animals perished within seconds. The last people of Nehekara fell to the ground, many of them the nomadic tribes that Al-Kadazar had built his power base from, their skin withering as they aged a century in the blink of an eye. Within minutes there was not a single living creature in the entirety of Nehekara. Such was Nagash's execration of Al-Kadazar, who had thwarted his plans for so long that he spared the imprisoned king to witness the horrifying fate that had befallen his former kingdom. Whilst the great ritual scoured the land of life, some things remained undetected far beneath Nagashazar. While Nagash was channeling his great spell, drunk with magical power and lost in dreams of triumph, Al-Kadazar, the last king of Nehekara, was mysteriously freed from his prison below Nagashazar by a group of hunched, heavily cloaked, rat-like creatures. A powerful blade, made of the purest warpstone, was pushed into his hands. Gripping the hilt of the weapon, Al-Kadazar was guided by an unknown force as he wandered into the throne room of Nagash with the dreaded Fellblade in hand. With the dust clouds of a titanic undead horde coming nearer by the hour, the king knew that he needed to end all of this now. With faltering steps, the king approached, hesitating before the towering figure. Aided by a malevolent mental urging, the king struck. At the last moment, Nagash raised a claw to ward off the blow. The Fellblade was far too powerful to ward, though, and clove through Nagash's spell, cleaving the necromancer's upraised fist. In retaliation, the great necromancer snapped out of his stupor to unleash a heavy, deadly blast at the king. It was an epic struggle to behold, as the king of the dead and the king of the living fought for dominance of the mortal world. With his last bit of strength, the king once more drove on, and struck once more upon the necromancer's decaying body. The king went mad with vengeance, hacking at Nagash with every bit of strength he still possessed, until his sword's deadly enchantments took hold. Soon the deadly blade smashed through the iron-hard bones of the Lich Lord, and finally it laid shattered in 1,000 pieces, and the threat to the world was over. With his death, Al-Kadazar staggered away, as the king looked once more across his once beautiful land. His land and his people were no more, and the king wept at the sight, despair washing over the fire within his heart. He aimlessly tried to walk back to his homeland, as the Fellblade took more and more of his life and soul away. The king walked, his body and soul being eaten and drained, until he finally fell upon the river Mortis. There the king died, and the legendary hero's body was never seen again. And so came the end of Al-Kadazar, the unsung hero of the mortal world.
Though Nagash was defeated that day, part of his spirit still lingered on in his magical artifacts, the most prominent of which was the Crown of Sorcery. When Nagash was defeated, Al-Kadazar tried to find his way back home with the crown in his possession, but the loss of his people and the evil of the Fellblade eventually made him succumb to his wounds, and he fell upon the bank of an unknown river. Al-Kadazar's frozen and frostbitten body was found in the melting spring snow beneath the banks of Blind River by Kadon, the shaman of the Lodringen folk. Kadon recognized Al-Kadazar for a mighty king and ordered a barrow built for his corpse. There was something about the crown that attracted him, though, and he kept it to his eternal damnation. Part of the great necromancer's spirit was infused in the crown, and it fed the old man some of Nagash's secrets. His dreams were full of whispered promises, and his mind was filled with dreams of an empire. Soon his noble soul was corrupted by the crown's pulsing evil. He told his tribesmen that he had a vision, and ordered them to build a city on the site of Al-Kadazar's burial mound. He named the city Morcaine, which in the tongue of his people means the place of death. For a brief time, a wicked civilization blossomed in the Badlands, stretching from the shores of the Black Gulf to the entrance of Mad Dog Pass, from Blood River to the edge of the Marshes of Madness. Colonies were even established in the area that would later become known as the Border Princes. The orcs were pushed back out of the Badlands, back to the World's Edge Mountains. His mind filled with dreadful visions, Kadon began to recreate the books of Nagash, inscribing the great necromancer's dark tale and committing much of his secret lore to paper. His vision was skewed by the crown, and he took to worshipping Nagash as a god and forced his followers to do the same. Soon the cult of Nagash was reborn, and undead things kept guard over its temples. Kadon himself lived in a palace of black marble, built over the entrance to Al-Kadazar's burial mound, and was considered the most devout of Nagash's worshippers. The Badlands were not fertile, and the population of Morcaine was never great, but with labour provided by untiring zombies, citadels were built and harrows excavated. Roads were erected to link the far corners of the land to the capital.
Kadon was no mere acolyte, but a potent sorcerer in his own right, and as his mind filled with the great necromancer's knowledge, he began to devise his own spells. He wrote his infamous grimoire in ink distilled from blood, in a volume bound with flayed human skin. Morcaine became the site of ever blacker evils. The dwarfs, who had once traded with the humans, turned their faces from them and shunned them. Drawn to the crown's power, Nagash's severed talon was found by Kadon's acolytes. He took the thing and wrapped it around with dreadful spells, turning it into a powerful, evil artifact which he used to cow his followers. At one point, the armies of Morcaine laid siege to the dwarf fortress of Barak Var, but the iron-sheathed walls of the keep defeated them, and they eventually withdrew. The necromancers of Morcaine became inward-looking and decadent, and the period of expansion was over. Then from the mountains became a savage horde of orcs, under warlock Dork Redeye. Redeye was armed with an enchanted blade that made him invincible against evil magics, and the men of Morcaine and their undead lackeys were no match for this savage horde. The howling green-skinned devils swept through Kadon's kingdom with fire and sword, driving few survivors north. Kadon himself was slain by Redeye in an epic duel amid the blazing streets of Morgheim. Upon his death, his kingdom ended. Kadon's chief disciple snatched his crown and his dead master's head and fled northward, often being forced to hide from the orc pursuit. Today, almost no trace can be found of the lost kingdom of Morcaine, save a few fire-scorched ruins and haunted harrows, within which evil things dwell. These blighted remnants of the lost kingdom account for the burial mounds scattered throughout the Badlands and the Border Princes. Some of those who survived entombed themselves alive within the barrows, and their evil spirits lurk there still. Others who lived through the fall of the kingdom carried their evil knowledge northwards into a land where new power stirred. The man-god called Sigmar had arisen to unite the warring tribes of men and forge an empire with blood and fire. Within his realm were shadowy corners where the necromancers could practice their vile art. At the same time Sigmar founded his empire, dark rumours shifted northward that an old evil had been reborn. The Council of 13 believed that they had destroyed Nagash. They were wrong. So mighty a being, so adept in the ways of undeath, could not easily be dispatched from the world. His corporeal form had been destroyed, but his spirit lived on. It waited beyond death, still rooted to the world by the presence of his claw, his crown, and his tomb. Nagash had long planned for the possibility of his death, and part of his spirit and his power had been imbued in his crown, allowing him a foothold in the world of the living. Although it might take many centuries, Nagash would return, and when he did, the manner of his returning was to be spectacularly horrible. His body had been burned in the furnaces of Nagash Saga, and all that remained of it were particles of black sooty dust drifting in the wind. One by one these particles were drawn to each other. Down the centuries, clumps of them slowly coalesced in the desolation of Nagash, forming black putrescent blobs that flowed inch by inch across the country to the Black Pyramid of Nagash in Khemri. At the rate of 1 drop a year, the sarcophagus slowly filled with the vile black fluid, becoming a dark chrysalis from which an evil was being reborn. As the fluid congealed, parts clotted till they became hard as bone. Overlaying this ebony skeleton, unnatural organs grew. Worm-like clumps of veins writhed and burrowed their way through the newly forming muscles. A sinister carapace of horny skin grew to cover the mass. Only the right hand, cut off by Al-Qadazar, did not regrow. One dark night, centuries after his defeat by the Skaven, the lid slowly rolled back from the sarcophagus, and Nagash emerged once more into the world. Outside his tomb, Khemri was still. Nagash stood atop his pyramid and bathed in dark power. Although still mighty beyond mortal measure, he was but a pale shadow of his former self. He was weakened by his long sojourn beyond death, and part of his power was still lost in his claw and crown. He called upon the dead of Khemri, but they hated him in death as they hated him in life, and he no longer had the power to bind them as once he had. He could control a portion of Khemri's countless dead, but the others rebelled, and for a time there was a civil war within the greatest of the necropolises. Eventually Nagash became tired of this and visited the other cities of the dead. There the tale was the same. The dead remembered him, and they hated him with a strange, unnatural hatred that centuries had bred. Although individually more than a match for any of the Tomb Kings, Nagash could not stand against the alliance that had formed against him. For a long time, in his long unlife, he was driven out of his native land. He brooded on his fall, and decided once more that he would use the power of Warpstone to augment his strength and make his enemies pay. Once more he travelled north, setting his feet on the path that he had so long ago followed to the shores of the Sour Sea. This time he was accompanied by an army of loyal undead followers. At last he came to Nagash Saga and found the Skaven entrenched there. For years they had mined the Warpstone, using it for their own fell purposes until it was almost exhausted. Nagash Saga itself had become a gigantic warren for the Ratmen, although a comparatively less populous one, for no food could grow in the desolation of Nagash, and it all had to be shipped in from other Skaven holds in return for Warpstone. Nagash approached the gates of his former fortress and demanded entrance. The Skaven garrison commander looked down on him and cursed and chittered insults in his own vile tongue. With a word, the great necromancer slew him, and then with a word he opened the gates, for he had forged them and knew all the secret commands to which they would respond. In one night the forces of Nagash swept through the cursed pit and overwhelmed the surprised Skaven, driving them from the city.
You see now, this is what you are. This is who you are. Embrace it, and the pain will end. Cease your resistance. Give me your flesh to wear. You cannot keep my spirit out forever, and when you are mine, I shall give you power beyond your wildest imaginings. This petty empire of man that you have built is nothing to what we might achieve together. There are lands far beyond these shores to be conquered, worlds beyond this paltry rock to be enslaved. Stand at my side, and this entire world will be yours. Nagash was now in control of his citadel, but was angered beyond mortal comprehension to discover that the Warpstone was almost exhausted by Skaven mining. The devices he had used to refine, concentrate, and purify it for his own sorcerous purposes were all destroyed. Even had they not been, there was no longer enough Warpstone that he coveted to allow him to recreate the Great Summoning. Undaunted by the armies the Council of 13 sent to reclaim Nagash Saga, the great necromancer set to work. First he laboured in his forges, creating a great metal talon for himself to replace his lost claw. His undead hosts carried out instructions under his supervision to make the device. The artificial claw was cunningly wrought and covered in disturbing runes that hurt the eye. It was as flexible and useful as a normal hand, and many times stronger. Now Nagash could once more hold a weapon with his own hands. He could create more devices and summon the spirits of the dead, interrogating them for information, and slowly, piece by piece, he reconstructed the events that had taken place during his long absence. He heard of the disappearance of Al-Kadazar, and how he had been driven to madness and death by the crown and exposure to the Skaven's death blade. Eventually, his attention was drawn to the north, where Kadon's heir, Marath, had taken his crown. Wrapping himself in a black cloak and many powerful protective enchantments, Nagash set out in secret for the northern lands, determined to reclaim what was his. Far was his destination, and many were his battles on the hard road to the cold northern lands. Nagash travelled through lands where stalwart dwarf warriors battled orcs and goblins, and where the followers of chaos still lurked. He eventually arrived in the lands of the nascent empire, and took up residence in the long-abandoned ruins of the elf city of Tamara. This was to be his base, from which he would scour the north in search of his crown. From the ruins, Nagash sent messengers, winging out to locate Kadon's heir. But Marath was dead. The evil mage was slain by Sigmar, and the crown was in the possession of the first Emperor of Man. Sensing its utter evil, he refused to use it and kept it under lock and key within his treasure vaults, far from the eyes of those who might be tempted by it.
The dead do not squabble as this land's rulers do. The dead do not fight one another. The dead have no desires, no petty jealousies or ambitions. The world of the dead is a world at peace.
Even as the Empire indulged in a sigh of relief and glorified themselves upon their achievements, the tribes failed to notice the cold winds of death blowing strongly to the south. Even as Sigmar basked himself in his triumphant homecoming victory, far to the south, Count Marcus of the Menegoths was burying the body of his only son until a stranger appeared in the scene. He bore the camel skin of a Nehecaran, yet there was a paleness in his appearance which contrasted with his own skin. In mere moments, the encounter with this swarthy gentleman turned violent, and a hulking undead warrior clad in chaos armor strode through the melee, butchering all of Count Marcus's warriors with violent explosions of vaporous blood. Even as the end drew near, a dark looming shadow appeared behind the two creatures, and as the tanned stranger choked the life out of the Imperial Count, Marcus knew his name, a name which was the very personification of death. The looming shadow was known as Nagash. Words didn't reach Sigmar about the Menegoth's destruction, at least not until the very same caramel stranger met the Emperor, when he came to the woods looking for an ancient weapon known as the organ gun. There the stranger gave Sigmar an ultimatum. Give up the crown of sorcery and serve the will of his master, or his empire shall perish under a flood of dead. Brave Sigmar rejected the creature's claims, and as the creature fled the scene upon a black hell steed, the Emperor once again rallied the Empire for war. And yet the Empire needed time, and time was against them. As Sigmar rallied his knights and mustered his warriors, the capital of the Menegoths was brought to the ground by the invading hordes of Nagash. Worse still, mighty fleets of undead corsairs plagued the trade lines to the west, blocking off many ships heading towards the growing city of Jutumsreich. When Sigmar rallied the armies, he came upon the Cherusan settlement of Ostengard, now overtaken by the undead and devastated. Even as the settlement was purged, reports from across the empire began to stream in that the dead were rising everywhere. Settlements from the southern Middle Mountains were abandoning their homes, and the refugees were streaming into Middenheim in a great flood. Western settlements had begun to be raided by beastmen and brigands, as a foul pestilence and the onset of winter forced these creatures into desperation, in turn smelling easy pickings among the disturbed human settlements. Soon it became apparent that the final battle needed to take place within the gates of Reichdorf itself. Salvation and revelation came for the Empire when Sigmar's most trusted advisor, Eoforth, High Scholar of the Empire,
delved deep into the great libraries of Reichdorf. There, a great many of the most useful tomes that had come from the dusty library of Marath, the necromancer of Brass Keep, though copies of translated manuscripts from the far south had come to Reichdorf's great library via the Empire's southern kings. Oral tales told by traders returning from the southern lands of searing deserts or from across the world's edge mountains had been painstakingly compiled by the library scribes. There the scholar learned the true being known as Nagash. Nagash was a figure only dimly recalled in ancient legends and the pages of dusty tomes to the men of the Reich. But Sigmar alone had known the truth of him, for when he faced the necromancer of the Brass Keep, he claimed from him Nagash's fabled crown of sorcery. Through it, the Lord of the Undead sought to entice Sigmar to be his champion, but his magic had proved futile against Sigmar's will, who then placed the crown in a guarded vault under the care of Shalyan priestesses. Inextricably linked with the tale of Nagash was the tale of the crown he had forged, and into which he had bound the essence of his damned soul. This, the ancient tale-tellers agreed, was the source of Nagash's greatest power and his greatest weakness. The manuscript from the burning galley spoke of an ancient warrior named Al-Kadazar, who slew the Lord of Undeath with a dreadful sword of fell power, and cast his bones and crown into a great river. A greenskin invasion had destroyed the city. Everywhere the crown appeared in history, great devastation quickly followed. Terrible invasions, cataclysms of dreadful power, or corruptions of once noble civilizations into barbarism. The crown was a talisman of woe, a bringer of destruction that brought only misery and death wherever it came to light. And it was buried in the heart of Reichdorf. Driven with utter terror, the scholar rushed with all haste to bring his news to Emperor Sigmar before it was too late.
Some, though headless, stood erect. Some, the arms were hacked from. Some were pierced from front to back. And some in horse in their armour sat. Some were choked while at their food. Some were drowned in flood. And some were withered up by fire. Some raving mad and others dead. Merciful Shalyar of the sorrow pours bright tears from her eyes, weeping and wailing the fate of men. Alas, my grief that ye did not heed her cries.
Bloated and swollen by the Menegoth dead, the army of Nagash pressed further north and took the city of Sigurdheim in a matter of days. Thousands of undead warriors had marched up the rugged peak and broke through its defences, and the city fell in a night that held sway over the tribal territories of the cosmopolitan southerners. The Count Sigurd was slain in combat with a vampire, and returned from death as a wight, just as his vassal Count Marcus had before him. Soon, for every victory won, the legions of the undead were growing to near-apocalyptic numbers. It was not mere whim that Nagash had divided his forces, for he had sought to deprive the Empire of its greatest strength, unity. His forces assailed every province, even as far as the great city of Middenheim. His purpose was not to destroy or conquer, but simply to keep the tribes from riding to the defence of their emperor, even as he rode hard to Reichdorf. Nagash's baleful eyes were turned upon the great capital, for he knew that his ancient crown and his final victory would be found there. See the fate of all flesh, and no despair.